There are stories in the wild that no one believes until they happen. Not the kind with claws and fangs and fear, but the kind that slips quietly between moments. The kind that makes you stop, take a breath, and question everything you thought you knew about animals. And maybe even about love. This story began on a cold April morning in northern Montana, in a stretch of road most travelers forget even exists. No tourists, no noise, just snow melting beneath the pines, and the air carrying that distinct smell of spring trying to be born. A ranger poured his coffee expecting silence. But what he found instead was something wild, something wounded and something watching. At first glance, it seemed like a predator and prey locked in nature's cruel design. But then the forest opened its mouth and whispered a different kind of truth. A truth we don't often allow ourselves to believe, that loyalty might live in silence, that courage doesn't always roar, and that love sometimes walks on four paws. Before we begin, take a moment. Breathe in. Because this story might stay with you longer than you expect. It started with a radio crackle. Ranger Eli Thompson had been driving the Glacier Highway since dawn, just him a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm and the endless trees of northern Montana folding in around his truck like green velvet. He wasn't expecting anything more than a few elk sightings or maybe a fox darting across the road. But when the dispatcher's voice came through low, a little unsure, it sent a quiet chill through his chest. Unusual movement on mile marker 42. It might be a mountain lion, or something bigger. 10 minutes later, Eli crested a bend in the road and hit the brakes. What he saw didn't make sense, not even in the strangest corners of his memory. Lying in the middle of the road was a bobcat female, maybe 2 years old. But she wasn't just lying there. She was trapped, her lean body twitching, ribs rising and falling in a shallow, panicked rhythm. And wrapped around her like a grotesque sculpture was a thick yellow-brown coil of muscle. A python, at least 15 feet long, maybe more. Every few seconds its body pulsed, tightening while its head hovered just inches from hers, tongue flickering with a cold, alien calm. For a second, Eli didn't move. Couldn't. A python. In Montana, this wasn't the Everglades. This was bobcat country, cold, high-elevation snow just barely melting from winter. But there it was unmistakable. A Burmese python, invasive and deadly, was somehow here where it didn't belong. Later, an investigation would reveal what had likely happened. A private exotic animal collector based illegally just outside Missoula had been cited months earlier for keeping dangerous reptiles without proper permits. No one knew he had more than one python or that one had gone missing. Somehow it had survived in the wild, slithered into this forest, and collided with something it never would have met in its natural world. Eli snapped out of his shock and grabbed the staff from the back of his truck. Dispatch. I need backup immediately. Bobcat in distress. Repeat possible attack by non-native python. He stepped forward, slow and cautious. The python's head lifted, sensing his movement. The bobcat's eyes flicked toward him, glassy, half-lidded. She let out a choked gasp, but before Eli could take another step, the forest exploded. From the thicket on the left came a sound more thunder than roar. A blur of movement, a flash of gray and gold rushed past him like a storm. It was another bobcat, larger, male. And he wasn't just charging, he was aiming. He slammed into the python with a force that sounded like dry wood snapping. Teeth bared, claws flashing, he bit down hard into the snake's midsection. The python recoiled, but it didn't loosen its grip, not right away. Its coils tightened, trying to finish the kill. But the male didn't stop. He fought with a fury that was brutal and silent. No growls, no dramatics, just teeth and will. The python hissed, coiled tighter, but the bobcat bit again, this time behind the head, causing the snake to finally writhe backward and release. The female collapsed onto the asphalt, gasping. Still alive. More rangers arrived moments later, stumbling out of trucks with stunned expressions. Eli shouted, "Don't hurt the cats. Focus on the snake." They used poles, noise, and distance to drive the python off into the brush, where it eventually disappeared, wounded but alive. and the male bobcat. He didn't run. He didn't bolt like most wild animals do when humans approach. He stood over the female body, heaving chest slick with blood, not his, but the python's. His eyes locked onto hers, then onto Eli's. There was no fear, no threat, just something still, something ancient, something that said, "I'll stay." That's when Eli knew. This wasn't over. The female, barely conscious, needed immediate help. Her body bore deep purple marks where the snake had wrapped itself, evidence of fractured ribs and possible internal injuries. But getting close wouldn't be simple. The male paced around her like a sentry. When a ranger knelt too near the bobcat, let out a low, guttural sound, not a growl, but a warning. So Eli did something he'd never done before. He crouched down and spoke softly, not to a pet, not to a zoo animal, but to a wild creature that owed him nothing. "We just want to help," he whispered. "We're not taking her away. We're making sure she stays." And perhaps that mattered. Because after a few tense minutes, the male stepped back. Only 2 paces, but enough. The rangers moved quickly. They wrapped the female in warm towels, eased her onto a stretcher, and injected a mild sedative to keep her calm. The male never took his eyes off her. When they tried to close the tailgate of the rescue vehicle, he leapt up, planted his paws beside her, refused to be left behind. One ranger murmured, "He's trying to go with her." Eli just nodded. He already made his choice. So they made space. They moved her to a flatbed truck, padded the floor, and let the male ride alongside. To the wildlife center, he lay there, pressed close but careful, silent but present. When her breath hitched, he lifted his head. When she groaned, he twitched his ears. He wasn't panicking, he was listening. And in that truck on a narrow forest road slick with melting snow, something sacred happened, a bond that had no words, no explanation, no precedent. But it was real. Later, the staff at the center would try to explain it scientifically, behaviorally. But sometimes, nature doesn't care for our categories. Sometimes what we call instinct is just love in its oldest form. And this was only the first chapter, because what happened next, no one could have predicted. Not all battles in the wild are about food or survival. Some are chosen. And when Ash, the male bobcat, threw himself into the coils of that python, it wasn't to claim territory or secure a meal. It was something else. Something deeper. Something that confused even the most seasoned rangers who witnessed it. Let's pause here and understand just how unlikely that moment was. Bobcats are solitary animals, fiercely independent. From the time they leave their mother's side, usually at just 9 or 10 months old, they carve out their stretch of land and defend it with unshakable instinct. They don't mate for life. They don't raise young as a pair. And they certainly don't form protective bonds with unrelated members of their kind. So when Ash charged headlong into that python, not just any snake, but a Burmese python, nearly triple his length and twice his weight, he did something that defied not only biology, but thousands of years of behavioral patterning. And he didn't hesitate. The python was mid-constriction, every loop of its muscle crushing the breath out of Juniper's body. A lesser predator might have waited, hesitated, calculated. But Ash came with force, focus, and no sign of retreat. He didn't snarl, he didn't roar. He moved like something that had already made peace with pain. Eli the ranger described it later like this. He didn't come for a fight, he came for her. There's a difference, and that difference mattered. The first hit was brutal. Ash lunged straight for the snake's midsection, aiming not for show, but for damage. His teeth sank deep into the python's flesh, drawing dark blood. The snake coiled tighter around Juniper in reflex, but Ash didn't back off. He bit again this time, near the base of the python's head, a vulnerable spot that even experienced handlers aim for. The python thrashed, disoriented by pain, and began to loosen its grip. Juniper slipped to the ground like a cloth being wrung out, limp, wheezing alive. But Ash wasn't finished. Even after the threat retreated into the grass, he didn't leave her side. He didn't chase the snake. He didn't puff up or claim victory. He stood still, chest rising and falling blood on his muzzle, eyes flicking only between her face and the humans around him, as if to say, "She's not safe yet. I'm still here." For the biologists at the Wildlife Center, this moment stirred a quiet revolution. Dr. Rachel Voss, a field researcher with over 2 decades of bobcat tracking under her belt, watched the footage later with tears in her eyes. "We've spent years mapping their territories, cataloging their diets, logging their solitary behaviors. But nothing prepares you for the moment an animal decides to act, like something more." She went on to explain that while bobcats are known to defend dens or cubs, there's virtually no documented case of one fighting to protect another adult, especially not in such a sustained, deliberate way. What made Ash so different, we may never know. Maybe it was something in Juniper's scent, a recognition from an earlier unrecorded encounter. Maybe it was the sounds she made as she struggled, soft-choked, helpless. Maybe it was just timing. Right place, right pain. But maybe, and this is what Dr. Voss proposed in a seminar months later, maybe it wasn't about recognition or instinct. Maybe Ash felt what all mammals are capable of, but few allow connection. There's a term in wildlife biology called liminal response, a moment when an animal crosses the invisible threshold between instinct and emotion. It's rare, almost impossible to measure, but when it happens, it changes everything. In 2004, a lone female gray wolf was observed in Alaska, staying beside an injured sibling for over 48 hours without food or rest, nuzzling its body and growling at approaching bears. The injured wolf eventually died, but the behavior stunned researchers. They called it grief-like. Others called it love. Ash's behavior fit the same pattern, and it didn't end at the attack. After the rescue, as Juniper was lifted onto the stretcher and prepared for transport, Ash stayed close, never aggressive, never intrusive. He watched, he waited, he paced in slow, tight circles, and when the vehicle began to pull away, he climbed aboard. Not as a prisoner, not as cargo, but as something else entirely, a companion. The decision to let him stay was controversial. Some staff worried it was too dangerous, that Ash might panic in the moving truck, lash out, and disrupt Juniper's care. But Eli made the call. She needed him, he later said. And I think maybe he needed to finish what he started. So they rode together, the sun climbing over the ridges of Glacier National Park, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted trees. Ash never looked out the window, never flinched. He watched her chest rise and fall with every bump in the road, and when she whimpered in her sleep, he shifted closer, head tilted, ears forward. Still. Silent. There's something to be learned here, not just about animals, but about choice. Ash didn't have to fight. He didn't have to follow. He could have disappeared into the woods, back to the silent life of his kind. But he chose a different path. One that came with pain, risk, and a kind of devotion that no textbook could explain. And maybe that's the lesson. Sometimes the deepest loyalty doesn't come from habit, blood, or instinct. It comes from a decision, quiet, unwavering, to show up. To stand between someone and the thing that wants to crush them, even when no one's watching. Especially then. And as the Wildlife Center loomed in the distance, its roofline barely visible through the trees, Ash remained still. Eyes open, heart steady, beside her, always beside her. But the road to healing, physical and emotional, was only just beginning. When they arrived at the Wildhaven Wildlife Rehabilitation Center, it wasn't the usual chaos of a critical intake. No one shouted, no one rushed. Every footstep was quiet, every movement measured, because Ash was still there. Still in the truck bed, still curled around Juniper like a silent guard. The staff had prepped for her injuries, deep bruising, likely internal trauma, shallow breathing, but no one had planned for him. Not really. A wild bobcat choosing to stay by another's side even as humans crowded around them. That wasn't a behavior they were taught to expect. Dr. Evelyn Hart, the clinic's lead veterinarian, stood waiting with a clipboard in one hand and a knot in her chest. She'd seen mountain lions hit by snowplows, black bears poisoned by trash fox kits with broken paws. But this 2 bobcats, 1 broken one, refusing to leave wasn't part of any protocol. "He followed her here?" she asked Eli. Brows furrowed. Eli just nodded. He didn't just follow her, he saved her life. The team moved fast, but gently easing Juniper onto a gurney and rolling her inside. She didn't resist. Her body sagged under sedation fur matted with sweat and dust. But Ash, he wasn't sedated. He wasn't even leashed. Yet he followed at a distance of just a few feet, his paws hitting the tile floor like soft percussion eyes locked on the gurney, as if it were carrying his own heart. When a nurse tried to close the exam room door behind them, Ash let out a low, guttural sound, not a growl, not a warning. It was grief. Wild, raw, shaking, the kind of sound that pulled at something primitive inside every human there. So they opened the door again, and he walked in. Ash didn't interfere. He didn't claw at the equipment or snap at the staff. He simply lowered himself onto the floor beside the gurney. His massive head rested on his paws, his eyes watching every breath Juniper took. And there, in that quiet space of beeping monitors and antiseptic air, something extraordinary settled over the room. Trust. Not the trained kind you see between handler and animal in a zoo. This was the kind built over fire, fear, and choice. Ash had trusted the humans to help her, and now he was trusting them to not harm. Dr. Hart had to keep reminding herself, "He's wild, he's wild, he's wild." But everything about his presence said otherwise. He seemed to know somehow that they were trying to save her, and he wasn't going anywhere until they did. One nurse, Marissa, whispered, "It's like he's watching over her, not possessive, just present." Ash stayed beside her through the night. He didn't sleep. Every time Juniper's breathing hitched or a machine beeped too sharply, he lifted his head. His ears twitched, his body tensed, but he never lashed out, never tried to leave. He was alert, yes, but not fearful, and maybe that was the most astonishing thing of all. Because fear is the language wild animals know best when they're near people. They run, they hide, they fight. But Ash, he watched, and the humans began to change too. Normally, critical patients were kept isolated, low noise, no distractions, but they left the door cracked. They lowered their voices. They moved more slowly. The room, without anyone saying it out loud, became a sanctuary, not just for healing, but for something sacred. By dawn, Juniper stirred, just slightly. A twitch of her ear, a shift in her paw, her eyes fluttered cloudy and uncertain. Ash rose instantly, every muscle braced. He didn't move toward her. He didn't need to. She turned her head, barely lifting it off the bedding, and found his gaze. What passed between them in that moment, no one could describe. But everyone in the room felt it. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was just a look, a long, quiet knowing. She blinked. He chuffed low and soft. Then she laid her head back down. "Doctor." Hart exhaled for the first time in minutes. "She knows he's here," she whispered, "and that's all she needs right now." For the next 2 days, Ash stayed beside her. When the nurses checked her vitals, he simply watched. When the vet changed bandages or adjusted her IV, he didn't move unless they touched her paw. Then he would rise ever so slightly, just enough to make his presence felt. A reminder. Gentle. She's not alone. It wasn't just protective, it was reverent, and the team began calling them by name. They hadn't meant to anthropomorphize, but sometimes names help us hold on to things that feel too big to explain. So the male became Ash for the strength left after fire, and the female Juniper for the hardy, quiet plant that survives in the harshest ground. Ash and Juniper. Not subjects, not specimens, just Ash and Juniper. Visitors began to ask. Donors started to call. A local artist painted their likeness and sent it as a gift. The center's social media, usually quiet, lit up with comments, prayers, and personal stories of love that had survived trauma. "I lost my husband 2 years ago," one woman wrote. "But when I saw the photo of Ash lying beside her, I cried for the first time in months. That's what love looks like. Steady, even when it hurts." The staff, many of whom had worked in conservation for years, found themselves pausing before every shift, sitting a little longer beside the enclosure, speaking softer, listening more, because Ash wasn't just waiting, he was teaching. He was showing that trust isn't built in comfort. It's forged in fire, through choice, through patience, through the willingness to stay even when it's easier to flee. And perhaps that's the quiet lesson here. The wild, so often painted as cold and instinctive, sometimes reminds us how to love better, how to be present, how to keep watch, not with words, not with logic, but with loyalty. But nature, as always, has its clock. And while Juniper was beginning to heal, Ash was starting to fade. He barely ate, refused to walk. His muscles grew stiff from lying in place too long. The staff worried. Dr. Hart voiced what none of them wanted to hear. "If he doesn't rest soon, if he doesn't eat, we might lose him." And that would break her all over again. They had to make a decision, a hard one. Because sometimes love means staying close, and sometimes it means letting go. And so the hardest test was still to come. Separation. The Wild Haven Wildlife Rehabilitation Center was built to save animals, not to hold love stories. Its floors were scrubbed twice daily, its exam rooms filled with the gentle hum of machines meant to stabilize heartbeats, mend fractures, and monitor vital signs. It was a place of precision protocols and quiet urgency, but nothing in their manuals or training had prepared the staff for Ash. He was by every definition a wild animal, untagged, untamed, untouched by human hands until the moment he chose to follow Juniper into the unknown. And now, as the days passed and Juniper's condition slowly improved, the question everyone began to whisper was no longer, "Will she survive?" but rather, "What do we do about him?" Because Ash wasn't thriving. He hadn't eaten more than a few scraps since arriving. He refused to leave the room, even for the short enclosed outdoor enclosure designed for temporary wildlife enrichment. When staff opened the door to coax him out, he sat. When they offered raw meat or game hens, he nudged them aside with his paw. Not angrily, just distantly, as if none of it mattered if she wasn't coming too. His weight began to drop. His shoulders looked bonier, his coat duller. He limped slightly from the wounds sustained during the python fight, but it wasn't physical pain holding him still. It was fear. Fear that if he turned his back just for a second, he might lose her again. Evelyn Hart had seen this once before, though not in a bobcat. Years ago, a male golden eagle had been brought in after his mate was struck by a power line. The female didn't survive the flight to the center, but the male stayed perched on the enclosure branch for weeks, refusing to hunt or fly again. He watched the sky each night, silent, searching. "We think we understand animals," Evelyn once told a colleague. "But sometimes I think they understand things we've forgotten." Ash's devotion to Juniper wasn't theatrical. It wasn't needy. It was quiet and constant, like the sun across the floor, always there, always steady. And yet, it was becoming a risk. "We're reaching a limit," Evelyn said during the morning staff meeting. "If we don't separate them soon, Ash may crash. His body is holding on through willpower alone." Some staff disagreed. Others nodded reluctantly. But no one had a better answer. It was Marissa, soft-spoken, always watching, who finally said what everyone had felt but hadn't dared speak aloud. "If we take him away, will he understand?" That question lingered in the sterile, white room longer than any of them expected. Still, action was needed. So the team formed a plan. Not a severance, but a test. They would relocate Juniper to the rewilding enclosure, a secure, semi-natural space meant to help rehabilitated animals remember who they were. No direct contact with humans, minimal sounds, trees, water, and small prey, it would be the final step before full release. The hope was simple: if Juniper could stand on her own, maybe Ash would let go, or at the very least begin to remember what it meant to be a bobcat. That morning, just before sunrise, the team entered the recovery room. Ash was curled at the base of Juniper's bed. His eyes opened the second the door clicked. He didn't rise, he didn't snarl, he just watched. "Hey, buddy," Eli whispered. "We're going to try something, okay?" She's strong now. She's ready. Juniper, still groggy from sedation, didn't resist the stretcher. Her body moved with more weight, more steadiness than the week before. The bruising along her ribs had faded from deep violet to soft green. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes, though drowsy, flicked toward Ash as they lifted her. And Ash, he followed. Not close, not threatening, just enough to stay within reach, like a shadow that refused to stretch too far. They placed Juniper gently beneath a pine tree inside the rewilding enclosure. She stirred slightly. Ash watched through the gate, sniffed the air, circled the fence. Then they closed the door. For the first time since the rescue, Ash was on one side and she on the other. At first, he didn't react. He sat, waited, for hours. Then came the pacing, long, tight ovals around the gate, low, hollow sounds from his throat. At one point, he pressed his shoulder against the mesh, as if trying to reach her through vibration alone. A silent language only they understood. The staff monitored his behavior through cameras. No aggression, no self-harm, just waiting, long, aching, watchful waiting. But something happened on the third morning. Ash didn't come to the gate. Instead, his tracker showed him further into the woods behind the facility. A slow loop, a pause beside the old water trough, then deeper into the trees. Juniper, too, began to change. She ate, not much, but enough. She drank from the stream batted lightly at a fallen leaf. She climbed onto a low rock and stared at the tree line. She didn't call for him, but she looked, and the staff began to hope. A day later, they opened the final gate, the one that led not to another enclosure, but to the edge of the park itself. Untamed, unmarked. Home. Juniper walked out on her own, limping slightly. Slower than she once was, but steady, determined. She didn't look back. And Ash. He wasn't there. Not visibly, but trackers showed his signal nearby, lingering in a parallel stretch of forest just beyond the rewilding boundary. Two sets of paw prints never overlapping, never too far. It was like watching two stars drift apart in orbit, only to circle again quietly. A few days later, the staff received a handwritten letter from a local teacher. Inside was a crayon drawing from a second-grade student. It showed two bobcats walking beside each other under a tree, a heart between them. The caption, scrawled in block letters, read, "Ash stayed until she was strong. Then he waited again." The clinic wasn't built for love. But sometimes love found a way in anyway. And out there, beyond the gates, the wild was waiting. Because healing isn't the end of a story. It's where real survival begins. Out in the forest, just beyond the gates of Wildhaven, the world looked unchanged. Tall pines swaying gently in the mountain breeze, late spring sunlight filtering through needles like gold dust, the steady rhythm of unseen wildlife pulsing beneath it all. But for the people back at the clinic, and for two bobcats whose bond had defied instinct, something quiet and monumental had just shifted. Juniper had walked into the wild again. Alone. Ash wasn't beside her, not physically, but his presence lingered. His paw prints still pressed into the soft earth by the rewilding fence. His scent still clung to the branches near the stream. And every ranger monitoring her first steps into freedom knew one thing with quiet certainty: Ash was close. Close, but not clinging. That distinction mattered more than anyone could have imagined. For days, the staff had worried about how he would handle the separation. He had spent nearly 2 weeks refusing to eat, refusing to rest, refusing to step more than a few yards from Juniper's side. Every behavior he displayed defied what they thought they knew about bobcats. But then, in the silence of the trees, something changed. He didn't pace the fence anymore. He stopped circling her scent. He didn't cry out, didn't press his body against the mesh in protest. Instead, he turned toward the deeper forest, moving slowly, deliberately, as if testing each step not just for footing, but for meaning. Some would call it instinct resurfacing. Others might say he was reclaiming his wildness. But those who had spent time with him, who had watched him choose to stay by her side night after night, felt something more human in his stillness. It wasn't detachment, it was trust. He let her go. And in doing so, he did what most creatures, human or animal, struggle with the most. He trusted that letting go didn't mean giving up. Let's pause here for a moment, because it's a lesson many of us learn the hard way. We think love is about holding on, about proximity, about always being within reach. But sometimes love is most true when we take a step back, when we allow space, when we believe that the one we care for is strong enough to stand alone even if we ache quietly from a distance. Ash taught that in silence. There's a story from the Yellowstone region years ago about a mated pair of bald eagles. When one was injured by a fallen branch, the other stayed nearby for a time, circling daily, calling from the trees. But when the injured eagle finally began to fly, again her partner didn't return immediately. He waited from afar, watching until her flight became steady. Only then did he rejoin her. As equals, Ash seemed to know that lesson innately. He kept his distance but remained near, never intruding, never vanishing, just present enough to matter, invisible enough to empower. And Juniper. She rose to the moment. Camera traps placed along the forest edges showed her behavior in the days after release, cautious but curious, limping still but mobile. She drank from a spring, chased a squirrel half-heartedly, and rested beneath a fallen log. She was remembering how to be a bobcat, not just a patient, not just a survivor. She was becoming herself again. By the end of that first week, she'd wandered almost 2 miles into the heart of the park. The area was full of underbrush, ideal for hunting. Her collar pinged her location every 12 hours each time further from the gate. Stronger, bolder, and while Ash's signal never overlapped exactly, it danced like a shadow near hers. A parallel line, a protective orbit. One evening, Ranger Eli hiked out to check on a motion-triggered camera. When he reviewed the footage later that night, he paused at a frame that stole his breath. Juniper standing on a moss-covered ridge, her head tilted upward, and behind her, several yards back, barely visible between the trees, was Ash. Not moving, not advancing, just watching. And somehow, that was enough. He's protecting her, Eli told the team, but now it's from a distance she can grow in. The image went viral when the clinic quietly shared it with its supporters. Comments flooded in from around the country. That's not animal behavior. That's love. I didn't know bobcats could teach me about grief. He let her go. And in doing so, he stayed. The power of that lesson rippled far beyond the forest. A father wrote in to say he'd watched the video with his teenage daughter and ended up crying. She just left for college last fall, he wrote, and I thought I was supposed to be strong to forget. But watching Ash made me realize loving from a distance is still love. A retired nurse, once widowed, emailed to say Ash reminded her of her late husband, who'd held her hand through every chemo session, but never once made her feel weak. He stood by me until I could stand again. Then he stepped back and let me live. What Ash did, what he chose, wasn't just an act of wild instinct. It was a rare, quiet type of devotion that transcended species, transcended fear, even transcended logic. And that's perhaps the truest kind of loyalty. Not clinging, not demanding, just being there, even when it's no longer required. Back in the forest, as spring gave way to early summer, the snow receded, the creeks rose, and wildflowers began to bloom across the meadows. And in one of those clearings, 2 sets of paw prints, parallel and distinct, marked the damp earth. No longer desperate, no longer wounded, just walking forward, together, but free. But as nature often does, it would soon test them again, this time with something far more cruel than distance. 3 weeks had passed since Juniper stepped beyond the rewilding gate, and yet for many at Wild Haven it felt like watching the final pages of a story that didn't want to end. Out there in the untouched corners of Glacier National Park, life had found a rhythm again, not frantic, not dramatic, but quietly steady. And the proof of that lived in the tracks. Every morning, rangers would check the soft ground along creek beds and mossy forest paths. Some prints were familiar deer elk, the occasional black bear. But every so often they'd find 2 sets side by side. Bobcat tracks spaced a few feet apart, one slightly deeper, broader, the male. The other more delicate with a subtle unevenness from Juniper's lingering limp. Ash hadn't left, but he also hadn't rejoined. Instead, he seemed to walk parallel to her world. Watching, matching her pace, protecting, but never crowding. It was like witnessing a dance choreographed by instinct and something far softer, devotion, perhaps. A love that didn't seek control. That kind of strength sometimes means staying close enough to help, but far enough to let the other breathe. Rachel Myers, one of the park's senior biologists, had seen thousands of trail camera images over the years. Moose calves finding their first footing, foxes leaping joyfully through snowdrifts, even a mountain lion shielding her cubs from a storm. But when she reviewed the footage from one camera near Alder Glade, something made her stop mid-scroll. At first, it was just Juniper. She emerged from the brush slowly, the late afternoon light giving her coat a golden sheen. She sniffed the air, crouched near a pile of leaves, and waited. Seconds later, Ash appeared at the edge of the frame, far back just enough to remain unnoticed by her, but clear to the lens. He stood still as forward, body relaxed. When Juniper shifted her weight and moved off, he did the same. One step behind, never ahead, never beside. Rachel didn't move for a full minute. Then she whispered to herself, "They've found a new kind of bond. Not dominance, not dependence, just alignment." It was a word that stayed with her, because that's what it had become, alignment. Not in territory or breeding or survival, but in the presence. A silent agreement to remain near as long as it was needed. Biologically speaking, this still puzzled experts. Bobcats weren't known for long-term companionship. Even during mating seasons, their interactions were brief and transactional. Yet here were Ash and Juniper, weeks after rescue and release, still weaving through the forest in loose, loyal tandem. Dr. Evelyn Hart had a theory. "Maybe trauma changes them too," she said one afternoon. "Maybe when you survive something impossible with another being, something shifts. They're not the same animals they were before the snake. And maybe they don't want to be. It's not unlike us. Humans who've walked through fire, illness, grief, war, often find themselves drawn to those who are there too. People who understand the silence after the storm. Not everyone needs to talk about it, but sometimes just knowing someone else remembers is enough." Ash remembered. And so did Juniper. On a warm June morning, a trail camera captured them together again, not side by side, but closer than they had ever been since the separation. The image showed Juniper lying on a bed of dry needles, her head turned toward the rising sun. Ash stood nearby, not touching, but with his gaze trained gently on her. His posture was calm, not protective, not possessive, just present. When the footage was released as part of Wild Haven's monthly update, the online community responded with thousands of comments. Some shared their own stories of elderly couples who slept in separate rooms but held hands each morning, of siblings who spoke only once a year but always showed up in crisis. Others simply wrote, "This is the love I want. Let me find someone who walks my path like Ash." Alignment, that's the word. It's funny how 2 bobcats with no words and no vows could teach people so much about how to stay close without holding tight. But the forest, for all its beauty, is never still for long. By late June, signs of strain began to emerge. Rangers found old snares along the western ridge, rusted but deadly, evidence of illegal trapping. One morning, a shredded radio collar was discovered near a river crossing. Panic rippled through the team. Was it Ash? Was it Juniper? Search parties were deployed. Drones launched. The trackers gave faint signals, one steady, one skipping. For hours there was no clarity, until Juniper was found. She was pacing along the edge of a ravine, agitated eyes darting toward the tree line. She wasn't injured, but she wouldn't leave. She kept circling the same patch of ground, glancing into the undergrowth as if begging someone to follow her gaze. Eli knew that look. He followed her trail, slow and careful, heart in his throat. And there, nestled in the shadows, he found Ash. He was lying on his side, breathing hard, one hind leg twisted unnaturally beneath him. Embedded deep in the muscle of his thigh was a metal snare, old rusted but still vicious. Blood soaked the dirt. His eyes flicked upward as Eli approached, wide with pain, but not fear. Juniper stood nearby, her tail low, her body still. She had found him, and she had waited. What followed wasn't loud. There was no chaos, just soft voices, steady hands, and the subtle movements of a rescue team that understood they weren't just tending to a wounded animal, but to something sacred. As Ash was lifted into the stretcher, Juniper let out one long exhale. Not a cry, not a call, just letting go. As if to say, "You're safe now. I'll follow soon." And she did, to the forest edge. Then, like smoke, she disappeared into the trees, because love doesn't always look like closeness. Sometimes it looks like trust walking just behind. The trap wasn't new. It had been rusting in the shadows for years, its sharp jaws weathered, its hinges stiff, its metal almost blending into the soil, and dead leaves around it. But it still worked. And that was enough to harm something that didn't deserve it. When Ash was found tangled in that crude metal snare, the world seemed to pause. His hind leg was caught at a vicious angle, the steel biting through fur and deep into muscle. Blood had soaked the ground beneath him, not in pools, but in long, steady stains, as if he'd fought to free himself for hours. Or maybe he hadn't fought at all. Maybe he had just waited, trusted. And Juniper. She had found him first. The ranger team later traced her movements through the forest in the hours before Ash was discovered. She had paced the tree line, doubled back over her trail, circled again and again near the edge of the ravine. Not calling, not panicked, but there, constant, like a sentinel. It was her presence that led Eli to the place where the trees thinned and the earth gave way to silence and to Ash. Ash didn't flinch when they approached. He didn't growl or bare his teeth. His breath was labored, his eyes glossy from pain. But when Eli knelt and whispered, "We've got you, buddy," something shifted behind those amber eyes. Recognition. Not of a name or a voice, but of intention, of memory. This wasn't the first time he'd placed his trust in human hands. And so he surrendered. The rescue was slow and careful. Bolt cutters, gloves, a clean blanket. Ash was sedated gently, his body lifted onto the stretcher with reverence more than procedure. Juniper didn't follow immediately, but she didn't leave either. She stayed on the ridge above, watching the figures below move through their quiet work. Only when the truck began to pull away did she rise and trail behind, at a distance, always just behind. Back at Wild Haven, the mood was solemn. Ash wasn't just another injured animal anymore. He was part of something deeper, an unspoken promise the center had made not only to him, but to the story they had become. Evelyn stood over the operating table as the team cleaned the wound. It was worse than they'd hoped. Muscle-torn ligaments, damaged tendons frayed from the constant pull. Evelyn's hands trembled slightly as she worked her voice low. "I don't know if he'll walk right again," she said, "but we'll give him the chance." Hours passed. The wound was flushed, stitched where possible, and bandaged tightly. Fluids administered. Pain meds were balanced carefully for a body that wasn't used to captivity. And through it all, Ash remained still sedated, yes, but peaceful. Like something inside him recognized this wasn't danger, it was a sanctuary. When he finally stirred, the room fell silent. His eyes opened slowly, blinking against the sterile lights. He lifted his head just slightly, then exhaled a long, slow breath and lay it back down. He didn't panic. He didn't struggle. He just rested. For the first time in days. Juniper was nearby, not inside, but just outside his recovery enclosure. She paced less now, choosing instead to sit near the fence line, her ears tilted toward the building as if listening for him. When the team rolled Ash outside on a padded crate for fresh air, she appeared within minutes. She didn't touch the mesh. She didn't cry out. She just lay down, close enough to see him, far enough to let him heal. And somehow, that was enough. In the days that followed, Ash's progress was slow but steady. The limp was significant. He couldn't put full weight on the leg, but he tried. He stood when Juniper appeared. He responded to her soft chuffs with ones of his own. When he stumbled, she would rise slightly, ears alert, then settle again once he was steady. They never needed to touch to be close. And the staff began to understand something powerful. Healing isn't always physical. Yes, the wound needed stitching. Yes, the leg might never be the same. But Ash's true recovery came from something less measurable, from the knowledge that he wasn't alone, that something wild and quiet was waiting for him just beyond the wire. There's a truth many of us learn through hardship, that sometimes the greatest medicine isn't found in pills or procedures. It's found in presence. In someone who sees our pain, sits beside it, and doesn't try to fix it, just stays. Juniper stayed. And in doing so, she reminded everyone, watching from the interns to the most seasoned vets, that love, even in the wild, doesn't need to be loud to be real. It can walk on 4 legs. It can sit in silence. It can wait at the fence without needing to be let in. As Ash's strength returned, the question once again rose, what now? He would always limp. He might never hunt the same. But his eyes were bright again. His coat regained its sheen. And every day when the crate door was opened, he stepped forward, imperfect but willing. Evelyn stood by the gate one late afternoon, watching Ash hobble forward as Juniper lay nearby in the shade. She turned to Eli and said softly, "He'll never be as fast as he was." But maybe that's not the point. Maybe what he's carrying now isn't just a scar, it's a story. Because stories, real ones, don't end when the wound is closed. They continue, with every uneven step, with every soft glance, with every moment we choose to try again, even when it hurts. Ash tried, and Juniper never stopped believing he could. And one day soon they would return together, not as perfect predators, but as something more enduring survivors, side by side, free. It was a quiet morning when they opened the gate. No fanfare, no ceremony. Just the soft sound of metal hinges and the hush of pine needles underfoot as a new chapter waited on the other side. Ash stepped forward first. He still limped, a subtle hitch in his back leg that would never fully heal. But his steps were firm, measured. He didn't glance back at the humans who had cared for him, who had stitched his wounds, whispered encouragement, and worried over every breath. He didn't need to. Juniper was already waiting near the edge of the clearing. She stood in a patch of sunlight beneath a cedar tree, her tail still, her ears forward. She didn't rush to him. She didn't call. She simply waited. That had always been her way. And he came. They didn't touch noses or nuzzle or make any grand display. Instead, they fell into step beside each other, as if no time had passed at all. 2 wild hearts aligned again. This time, though, something was different. This wasn't a rescue. This was a return. They had both been through more than most wild animals ever face: injury, captivity. Fear, and that strange, uncertain thing that hovers between instinct and something more tender. And through it all, they had remained tethered. Not by fences, not by force, but by choice. That's what made this moment so powerful. They were choosing again. Not to stay in the safety of the enclosures, not to linger in the comfort of routine feedings or warm shelter. They were choosing the wild, choosing the unknown, choosing the very thing that had once tried to take everything from them, together. For weeks after their release, the Rangers kept watch through quiet observation posts and discreet trail cameras. They saw Juniper returning to her old habits, perching on high rocks at dawn, hunting voles along stream beds. Her limp had faded to a faint stiffness, nothing more. Ash stayed close. He never crowded, never pressed. But his prints were always near, his presence just beyond the tree line. Sometimes the cameras caught him in the distance, watching her from a ridge or lying silently on a ledge above her resting place. It was the same pattern they had lived during recovery, side by side but never entangled, present but never caging. There's a kind of wisdom in that. In the wild, and maybe in life too, some bonds thrive not by holding tight, but by walking freely together. It's a lesson not often taught, but deeply felt, especially by those who have known loss, pain, or recovery. By those who've had to learn the hard way that control and closeness are not the same. Ash and Juniper seemed to understand it naturally. They didn't need each other to survive. Not anymore. But they stayed close anyway. That, perhaps, was the most remarkable part. In late summer, a park visitor hiking along a ridge snapped a photo that would later become iconic. It showed Juniper curled in a patch of sun-dappled grass, her eyes half closed. Just a few feet away, Ash stood on a rock, backlit by afternoon light, his body still carrying the strength of recovery. His head was turned not toward the camera, but toward her. The caption in the local paper read, "He watched her breathe like it was enough." When Wildhaven shared the image, the internet lit up. Letters poured in again. People sent poems, watercolor portraits. A songwriter from Vermont composed a gentle folk tune simply titled Ash and Juniper. A woman from Arizona wrote, "After my stroke, my husband never hovered. He just sat nearby and let me be angry, tired, and stubborn. He let me be wild, even when I was broken. Now I know what that kind of love looks like." The world had seen many stories of survival, but this was something different. This was a story of staying, of two beings who chose to walk back into the unknown, not out of habit, but out of trust. Trust in each other, trust in the wilderness, trust in the idea that healing doesn't mean going back to who you were before, but becoming something wiser, quieter, stronger. That's what the forest gave them. Not safety, not certain, but the chance to begin again on their terms, and Wildhaven. They didn't try to bring them back. They didn't fit them with new tracking collars or make them part of a study. They let them go fully, because they understood some stories aren't meant to be measured. Some are meant to live where we can't always see them, but can feel them just the same. And if you were to walk through those woods now, maybe in the early morning when mist hugs the ground and the ravens haven't yet called, you might see two shadows slipping through the trees. One a little faster, one a little slower. Always just a few steps apart, and maybe, if you're lucky, you'll understand what they already knew. That love, real love, doesn't ask you to give up your wildness. It just walks beside it. And if this story found its way into your heart, maybe it's because part of you needed to be reminded that even in the most untamed corners of life, loyalty still exists. Healing is still possible. And sometimes, the quietest bonds are the ones that last the longest. If you believe stories like Ash and Juniper's deserve to be told, shared, and remembered, subscribe to this channel. Leave a comment below and tell us, when was the last time someone waited for you without needing to say a word? Because in a world that rushes and forgets, it's these silent tracks of love that remind us who we are.
Rain pounded against the pavement, forming glistening puddles that reflected the dim glow of the streetlights. The city felt colder at night, especially in the pouring rain, where the warmth of the day had long since faded into a damp, bone-chilling emptiness. Ryan pedaled his worn-out bicycle through the deserted streets, his hoodie soaked through, sticking uncomfortably to his skin. His shoes squelched with every push of the pedals, but he didn't care. This was normal. He had learned long ago that complaining didn't change anything. Tonight had been particularly rough. Deliveries had taken longer because of the rain, and a couple of customers had refused to tip, but at least he had made it through. At least he had one good thing waiting for him: a meal. As he pulled up outside the fast food restaurant where he worked, the manager handed him a small paper bag. "Good job, kid," the man grumbled, his voice tired. "Here, leftover meal. Don't say I never gave you anything." Ryan nodded, offering a grateful but weary smile. "Thanks." Clutching the bag, he hopped back onto his bike and headed toward his usual spot. A small bus stop with a half-broken bench and just enough of a roof to block some of the rain. By the time he reached it, his stomach was aching with hunger. He parked his bike, plopped down onto the bench, and carefully opened the bag. The smell of warm food hit him instantly: a burger and a small packet of fries. Not much, but to him it was everything. Just as he reached for the burger, a faint sound cut through the rain. A whimper. Ryan froze, his fingers tightening around the wrapper. It was barely audible over the storm, but it was there, a soft, weak cry coming from a nearby alleyway. He hesitated. It was late, he was exhausted, and it was probably just a stray cat or a pile of trash shifting in the wind. But then he heard it again. Ryan exhaled, rolling his eyes at his own conscience, then stood up, tucking the paper bag under his hoodie to protect it from the rain. Curiosity, or maybe something deeper, drove him forward. The alley was dark, the smell of damp concrete and discarded waste thick in the air. He squinted, adjusting to the dim light from a flickering street lamp. Then he saw it. A dog. A German shepherd, thin to the bone, its fur matted and drenched. It lay curled up against the brick wall, shivering violently, its ribs protruding through its soaked coat. Its ears were flattened, and its eyes, God, its eyes! Ryan had seen hunger before. He saw it in the mirror every morning, but this was different. Slowly he crouched down. The dog tensed, watching him cautiously, but too weak to move, too weak to run. Ryan glanced at the bag in his hands. He was starving. He hadn't eaten all day, but looking at the dog, he knew what real hunger looked like. Without a second thought, he unwrapped the burger, tore it in half, and carefully placed one piece on the ground in front of the dog. For a moment, nothing happened. The dog just stared at it. Then, hesitantly, it stretched its neck forward, sniffed the food, and devoured it in seconds. Ryan let out a soft chuckle. "Yeah," he murmured, breaking off another piece. "I know the feeling." He watched as the dog ate, its tail twitching slightly, the first sign of life he had seen in it. By the time the meal was gone, the rain had lessened to a light drizzle. The dog looked up at him, licking its nose, eyes a little brighter than before. Ryan sighed, shaking his head with a small smile. "Guess I'm not the only stray around here, huh?" He didn't know it then, but that night, under the dim city lights, with nothing but rain and a shared meal between them, something changed. The rain had finally stopped by the time Ryan got back to the orphanage that night, but the chill remained. As he lay on his thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, his mind kept drifting back to the dog, that look in its eyes, the way it had devoured the food, the way it had just stared at him afterward, as if trying to say something. Ryan turned onto his side, pulling his blanket up around his shoulders. He knew he shouldn't care. It wasn't his problem. But he did. The next evening, after finishing his last delivery, Ryan rode back to the alley. His stomach rumbled. He hadn't eaten all day, but he didn't care. He just wanted to see if the dog had made it through the night. But when he got there, the alley was empty. The spot where the dog had been was nothing but damp pavement. No paw prints, no sign of it ever being there. Ryan's chest tightened. Maybe it had wandered off. Maybe someone had chased it away. Maybe it hadn't survived the night. With a heavy sigh, he turned back toward his bike. But then, a movement in the corner of his eye. Down the street, barely visible in the dim light, a shadow moved between the buildings. Ryan narrowed his eyes. It was the dog. A small grin tugged at his lips as he hopped on his bike and pedaled toward it. But when he got closer, something strange happened. The dog didn't run. Instead, it watched him, then turned and started following. Ryan slowed his bike, glancing over his shoulder. The dog was keeping its distance but staying close, its golden eyes locked onto him. "You following me, buddy?" Ryan muttered, half amused, half surprised. The dog didn't react, just kept moving like a silent shadow behind him. A shadow? Ryan smirked to himself. "Guess I'll call you Shadow then." And so, Shadow followed him all the way back to the fast food joint. Ryan parked his bike and glanced down at him. "Stay here, okay?" Shadow sat, tilting his head slightly. Ryan took a deep breath and walked inside. His shift that night was rough. Deliveries were slow, customers were rude, and his stomach gnawed at him with hunger. By the time he clocked out, all he wanted to do was grab something cheap to eat and crash at the orphanage. But as soon as he stepped outside, Shadow was still there, sitting patiently in the shadows, watching, waiting. Something inside Ryan softened. He couldn't explain it, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel so alone. He reached into his pocket, counting the small amount of change he had. It wasn't much. Instead of buying himself dinner, he went back inside and bought a small portion of grilled chicken. When he returned, he knelt down and placed the food in front of Shadow. "Here, it's not much, but it's better than nothing." Shadow sniffed at it, then carefully took a bite. Not like a starving animal this time, but like he trusted the person giving it to him. Ryan smiled to himself, but the moment didn't last long. A voice cut through the night. "Ryan!" Ryan flinched and turned to see his manager storming toward him, eyes blazing. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ryan stood quickly. You were just feeding a mangy stray instead of working," the man snapped. "No wonder you've been late. First you start slacking, now you're wasting company food?" "It's my money," Ryan muttered. The manager folded his arms. "I don't care. You show up late one more time and you're done. Got it?" Ryan clenched his jaw and nodded. The man scoffed, shaking his head before walking off. Ryan let out a shaky breath and looked back at Shadow, who had flattened his ears, sensing the tension. Ryan knelt beside him again, scratching behind his ear. "Don't worry, boy. I won't leave you." Later that night, after finishing work, Ryan went back to the alley to check on Shadow one last time before heading home, but when he turned the corner, his stomach dropped. A group of teenagers stood in the alley, laughing and throwing things. At Shadow, the dog was pinned against the brick wall, dodging kicks and beer bottles. Ryan's blood ran cold. "Hey!" he shouted, storming forward. "Leave him alone!" The group turned. One of the older boys sneered. "What's it to you?" Ryan stepped between them and Shadow, his fists clenched. "He's not bothering you, just leave him be." One of the guys chuckled. "Look at this. Stray protecting a stray." Before Ryan could react, one of them shoved him hard. He stumbled back, landing on the wet pavement. Shadow let out a fierce snarl, stepping forward, his hackles raised. The teenagers hesitated. Ryan quickly got back on his feet and grabbed Shadow's collar. He didn't want to fight, he just wanted to get them out of there. "Come on, boy," he murmured. Shadow hesitated, but when Ryan pulled him away, he followed. The laughter of the group echoed behind them, but Ryan ignored it. As they stepped out of the alley, Ryan glanced down at Shadow, who looked up at him with those same grateful, knowing eyes. Ryan exhaled. "You really are a shadow, huh?" he murmured. Shadow just pressed his head against Ryan's leg, as if saying, "And I'm not leaving you either." The next morning, Ryan arrived at work 5 minutes late, again. He had tried his best, pedaling as fast as he could through the crowded streets, but he had stopped just for a moment to check on Shadow before heading in. It didn't matter that he had been working harder than anyone else. It didn't matter that he was exhausted or that his shoes were soaked through from last night's rain. The moment he stepped inside, his manager was already waiting. "You're late," the man said flatly. Ryan swallowed hard. I got caught in traffic. It won't happen again, I swear." The manager sighed, rubbing his temples. "Ryan, I've given you too many chances. I need reliable workers, not kids who show up when they feel like it. I need this job," Ryan pleaded. "Please, just one more chance." The man shook his head. "I'm sorry, but you're fired." Ryan's heart sank. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? He had no parents to beg for help, no backup plan, no savings, just a dog waiting for him outside. Without another word, Ryan turned and walked out. Shadow was still there, sitting patiently by the bike rack. The moment he saw Ryan's face, his ears perked, his tail giving a hopeful wag, until he realized something was wrong. Ryan sighed, crouching down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. "Guess it's just us now, huh?" Shadow pressed his nose against Ryan's arm as if to say, "I don't mind." But Ryan did. He rode back to the orphanage, the wheels of his bike slicing through puddles, his mind racing. What now? How was he going to eat? How was he going to keep Shadow safe? By the time he reached the orphanage gates, his stomach was twisting with anxiety. Maybe it would be okay. Maybe he could hide Shadow a little longer. He barely made it through the front door before the head caretaker spotted him. "Ryan Parker!" Her sharp voice rang through the hall, making everyone stop and stare. Ryan froze. Then he saw her gaze drop, and he knew. She had seen Shadow, who had quietly followed him inside. "What is that?" she snapped, pointing at the dog. Ryan stepped in front of Shadow instinctively. "He's not hurting anyone," he said quickly. "I swear You know the rules," she cut him off. "No animals allowed. This is a home for children, not strays." Ryan clenched his jaw. "He's not a stray." The woman crossed her arms. "Then take him back to wherever he belongs, because he's not staying here." Ryan's fingers tightened into fists. "He doesn't have anywhere else to go." The caretaker's eyes narrowed. "Then you have a choice, Ryan. The dog goes, or you do." Silence filled the hallway. Ryan's chest ached. Shadow was the only thing he had left. If he left him outside, alone, in this city, he wouldn't survive. His fingers curled into Shadow's damp fur. He already knew his answer. Ryan lifted his chin, forcing himself to meet the caretaker's gaze. "I choose him." A flicker of surprise crossed the woman's face. Then, with an exasperated sigh, she pointed at the door. "Then get out." Ryan swallowed hard and nodded. Without looking back, he turned and walked out into the cold, Shadow following silently beside him. The wind had picked up, sharp and biting against Ryan's damp clothes. By the time they reached the edge of the neighborhood, his hands were shaking, not just from the cold, but from the reality of what had just happened. He had nothing. No home, no job. Just a few crumpled bills in his pocket, and a loyal dog who had no idea they had just lost everything. Ryan pulled his hoodie tighter around himself and glanced down at Shadow. The dog was watching him, waiting. Ryan let out a breath, trying to force a smile. "Looks like we're really on our own now, huh?" Shadow simply pressed against his side, silent, steady. Together they wandered through the dark streets, searching for somewhere, anywhere to stay. But as the night deepened and the cold grew sharper, Ryan began to wonder if they would make it through at all. The wind cut through the city streets, sharp and unrelenting. Ryan pulled his hoodie tighter around himself, his breath visible in the freezing air. His stomach ached from hunger, his limbs numb from exhaustion. Shadow trotted beside him, his ears perked, always alert. They had been walking for hours, searching for somewhere, anywhere to take shelter. Ryan had considered the abandoned warehouse a few blocks away, but it was already filled with other homeless people. The park was out of the question, too dangerous at night. He was running out of options. Then, a scream. Ryan's head snapped up. Down the street, under the glow of a flickering streetlight, a man struggled against two figures dressed in dark hoodies. A mugging. Ryan barely had time to think. He dropped his bike and ran. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice cutting through the cold night. The thieves turned, startled. Ryan saw an older man, probably in his 60s, struggling to keep hold of his wallet. One of the muggers shoved him hard, sending him crashing onto the pavement. Rage flared in Ryan's chest. Without hesitation, he lunged forward, grabbing the nearest thief by the arm and yanking him back. The man cursed and swung at Ryan. He barely dodged in time, stumbling backward, but then a deep, menacing growl filled the air. Shadow. The dog leapt between Ryan and the thieves, his teeth bared, hackles raised. His growl was low and dangerous, echoing through the empty street. The muggers hesitated. Then Shadow lunged forward with a fierce bark. It was enough. The thieves turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness. Ryan let out a shaky breath and turned toward the man on the ground. He was clutching his chest, breathing heavily, his wallet still clutched in one hand. Ryan knelt beside him. "Are you okay, sir?" The man looked up, his expression a mix of shock and gratitude. I think so." Ryan helped him sit up. Shadow stood beside them, still watching the street like a silent guardian. The man exhaled and finally met Ryan's gaze. "You saved me?" he said, his voice filled with disbelief. Ryan shrugged. "You looked like you needed help." The man studied him for a moment, then, slowly, he smiled. "My name is Michael Dawson," he said, "and I think you and I need to talk." Michael Dawson was not just any man. He was a well-known businessman, the owner of one of the city's largest security firms. But at that moment, sitting on the cold pavement, wiping the dust off his expensive coat, he wasn't a CEO, just an old man who had been saved by a boy and his dog. Ryan helped him to his feet. "You sure you're okay?" Michael nodded, still catching his breath. "I should be asking you that, son. That was brave what you did." Ryan glanced at Shadow, who was still standing protectively beside him. "Wasn't just me," Shadow helped. Michael's eyes flickered to the dog, and then widened in shock. Ryan frowned. "What?" Michael took a slow step forward. "That dog. Where did you find him?" Ryan hesitated. "A few nights ago, he was starving, so I gave him my food. He's been following me ever since." Michael knelt down, studying Shadow carefully. The dog watched him but didn't move, didn't growl, just stared, as if trying to remember. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, Michael said, "Hunter?" Ryan blinked. "What?" Shadow stiffened. His ears twitched, his tail gave a single flick. Michael's breath caught. "Oh my God," he murmured. "It is you!" Ryan stared in confusion. "Wait, you know him?" Michael exhaled sharply and stood up. "This dog, he's not just a stray. He was mine." Ryan's heart skipped a beat. "Yours?" Michael nodded. "His name is Hunter. He was my family's protection dog. We had him since he was a puppy. 2 years ago, he went missing during a robbery at my estate. The thieves tried to take him, but he fought back. There was an accident, and we never saw him again." Ryan looked down at Shadow, Hunter, who was now watching Michael with an expression Ryan had never seen before. Recognition. Michael's voice grew thick. "I thought he was gone. We searched for weeks. I never thought I'd see him again." Ryan swallowed hard. He knew what was coming next. Michael was going to take him. Of course he would. This was his dog. His family, Shadow Hunter, belonged to him. Michael turned to Ryan, his face unreadable. Then, softly, he asked, "But he won't leave you, will he?" Ryan's throat tightened. Shadow Hunter had a home, a real one that Ryan had never had. But even now, standing face to face with his former owner, he didn't move. He stayed by Ryan's side, loyal, unwavering. Michael watched them for a long moment. Then, suddenly, he let out a quiet chuckle. "You two are something else," he murmured. Ryan braced himself for the inevitable, the request to give Shadow back. Instead, Michael smiled. "You saved my life tonight," he said, "and you saved his too. So I think it's only fair I return the favor." Ryan blinked. "What do you mean?" Michael placed a hand on his shoulder. I mean, I want to help you, kid. Not just with a job, not just with money. I want to give you a home. Ryan's breath hitched. A home? Michael nodded. I lost Hunter once. I'm not losing him again. And I don't think he's willing to lose you either. Ryan looked down at Shadow. Hunter. The dog wagged his tail slightly, as if he had been waiting for Ryan to realize what he already knew. For the first time in his life, Ryan felt something unfamiliar. Hope. A future. A home. The days of cold nights and empty stomachs felt like a distant memory. Ryan still had moments where he woke up expecting to be back on the streets, but every time he opened his eyes, he was in a real bed, under a warm roof, in a house that felt like home. Michael had kept his word. Ryan now had a place to belong. He had clothes that weren't worn to threads, meals that weren't just scraps, and for the first time in years, he had a future. Michael had enrolled him in school, insisting that Ryan deserved the chance to chase his dreams. At first, Ryan had been hesitant. He had spent so long just trying to survive that thinking about the future felt foreign. But slowly he started to believe in it. And through it all, Shadow never left his side. The dog who had once been a starving stray was now strong, well-fed, and truly happy. But no matter how much had changed, some things stayed the same. Shadow still followed Ryan everywhere, still waited at the front door when he went to school, still curled up at his feet whenever he studied late into the night. Because, in the end, Shadow hadn't just found his way back to Michael. He had found his way home, with Ryan. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and purple, Ryan sat on the front steps of the house, watching the first stars appear. Shadow lay beside him, his fur ruffling in the evening breeze, his ears twitching at the distant sounds of the neighborhood settling in for the night. Ryan reached into his hoodie pocket and pulled out a sandwich. It was a simple meal, just peanut butter and jelly, but it made him smile, because it reminded him of where it all began. Without a word, he tore the sandwich in half and placed a piece in front of Shadow. The dog looked up at him for a moment, then took the sandwich gently, just as he had that first rainy night in the alley. Ryan chuckled softly, rubbing Shadow's head. Guess we've come a long way, huh? Shadow wagged his tail, pressing his head against Ryan's arm. Ryan sighed, looking up at the night sky. For the first time in his life, he wasn't wondering where he'd sleep or how he'd survive another day. For the first time, he wasn't alone. And as he sat there, with his best friend beside him and a future ahead of him, Ryan finally understood something. Kindness was never wasted. It always found its way back, sometimes in the most unexpected ways. Ryan's story is proof that even the smallest act of kindness can change a life forever. A single meal shared on a rainy night led to an unbreakable bond. A second chance and a future filled with hope. Shadow was once just a stray, and Ryan was just a boy trying to survive. But together, they found what they had always been searching for: a home, a family, and a reason to believe in something bigger than themselves. Because kindness, no matter how small, always comes back in ways we never expect. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to Amazing Paws Stories for more incredible tales of loyalty, love, and second chances. Don't forget to like, comment, and share this video to spread the message that compassion can change the world, one paw at a time. See you in the next story.